Be me, 28-year-old woman who cares deeply about social justice and equality. Work as a marketing coordinator for a non-profit that focuses on community outreach. Spend most of my free time engaging in meaningful conversations about systemic issues and advocating for marginalized voices. Have always prided myself on being progressive and enlightened about important topics. Especially passionate about mental health advocacy and breaking down harmful societal expectations. Regularly share thoughtful posts about the importance of emotional vulnerability and seeking help. My social media feeds are full of resources about therapy, self-care, and supporting those who are struggling. Friends often come to me for advice because they know I'm well informed about these issues. Feel like I'm making a real difference by raising awareness and challenging toxic norms. Have a younger brother named Nolan who's 24. We used to be really close growing up, but drifted apart as adults. He's always been the quieter, more introspective type compared to my outgoing personality. Works as a software developer, keeps to himself mostly, lives about an hour away in his own apartment. We'd see each other at family gatherings and text occasionally, but nothing too deep. About 3.5 years ago, Nolan started seeming different. Noticed he looked thinner, seemed tired all the time, would make excuses to leave family events early or sometimes not show up at all. Mum kept asking if I knew what was wrong with him. Honestly thought he was just being dramatic or going through some quarter-life crisis phase. Figured he'd snap out of it eventually, like most people do. One evening in late fall, Nolan called me out of nowhere. Hadn't heard from him in like 2 months, which wasn't unusual, but his voice sounded weird, shaky almost. Said he needed to talk to someone and asked if I had time. Was in the middle of preparing a presentation for work about inclusive language practices, but figured I could multitask and listen while I worked. Hey Sarah, I know this might sound weird, but I've been struggling with some stuff lately. Immediately assumed he meant work drama or relationship problems. Started half listening while I continued typing my slides. What kind of stuff, Nolan? Work being stressful? There was this long pause and I could hear him breathing heavily. No, not work. It's more like, I don't know how to explain it. Could tell he was having trouble getting the words out. Thought he was being overly dramatic about whatever minor issue he was dealing with. He started explaining how he'd been feeling really overwhelmed and scared about everything. Said he couldn't sleep most nights and felt this constant sense of dread. Mentioned having panic attacks at work and feeling like he couldn't function normally. Was going into detail about how even simple tasks felt impossible. How he'd been isolating himself because being around people felt overwhelming. Honestly thought he was just being weak and making excuses for being antisocial. Kept working on my presentation while he talked. Was getting kind of annoyed because I had important work to finish. And here he was complaining about feeling overwhelmed by normal adult responsibilities. Figured he just needed some tough love and a reality check. Started giving him what I thought was helpful advice about time management and prioritizing. Nolan, everyone feels stressed sometimes. You just have to push through it. Maybe you need to get better at organizing your schedule. Have you tried making to-do lists? That always helps me stay focused. Could tell he was getting frustrated with my suggestions. Voice started sounding more desperate as he tried to explain. Said it wasn't about being disorganized, that something felt genuinely wrong. Mentioned he'd been researching symptoms online and thought he might have depression or anxiety. That's when I really started getting irritated. Felt like he was trying to self-diagnose with trendy mental health terms. Thought he was just looking for labels to excuse his lack of motivation. See this all the time with people who want to blame their problems on mental illness instead of taking responsibility. Even though I advocate for mental health awareness, I know the difference between real, clinical issues and just being weak. Look, Nolan, I know everyone likes to throw around terms like depression and anxiety these days. But you can't just use those as excuses every time life gets a little challenging. Sometimes you need to just man up and deal with your problems instead of wallowing. Told him he was being weak and that he needed to stop making excuses. Said he should focus on building resilience instead of looking for reasons to avoid responsibility. Suggested he start exercising more and maybe read some self-help books. The silence on the other end of the phone was deafening. Could hear him breathing, but he wasn't responding to anything I was saying. Figured my tough love approach was finally getting through to him. Thought he was processing my advice and realizing I was right. Nolan, are you still there? His voice came back completely different, flat and cold. Yeah, I'm here. Thanks for the advice, Sarah. Said he had to go and hung up before I could respond. Didn't think much of it at the time. Assumed he was embarrassed that I called him out on his victim mentality. Figured he'd come around once he started taking my suggestions seriously. Went back to working on my presentation about supporting marginalized communities. Felt good about giving him the reality check he needed. Days turned into weeks and didn't hear anything from Nolan. Mum asked if I'd talk to him because he wasn't returning her calls either. Told her he was probably just going through a phase and needed space. Assured her that I'd given him some good advice and he was likely working on himself. Didn't mention the specifics of our conversation because I didn't want her to worry unnecessarily. Christmas came and Nolan didn't show up to family dinner. Said he was sick and couldn't make it. Mum was really worried, but I convinced her he was probably fine. Told her he was just being antisocial and would come around eventually. Spent the holiday talking about my work with the non-profit and recent advocacy campaigns I'd been involved in. Months passed and still no contact from Nolan. Occasionally would see him post something generic on social media, so knew he was alive. But he never responded to my messages or calls. Started getting annoyed that he was holding a grudge over me trying to help him. Felt like he was being immature and punishing me for caring enough to give him honest feedback. Meanwhile, my advocacy work was going really well. Had started a monthly discussion group about mental health stigma and toxic masculinity. Regularly posted about the importance of men being allowed to express emotions. Shared articles about how harmful it is when society tells men to toughen up instead of seeking help. Felt proud of the awareness I was raising about these critical issues. Friends would comment about how insightful my posts were and how much they learned from me. About a year after our phone conversation, tried reaching out to Nolan directly. Sent him a long text explaining that I understood he was upset, but that sometimes the people who love us most have to tell us hard truths. Said I hoped he'd taken my advice and was in a better place now. Told him I missed him and wanted to rebuild our relationship. Message was read but never got a response. Tried a few more times over the next couple years. Birthday messages, holiday texts, casual check-ins. Everything was always read but never answered. Started feeling hurt and confused about why he was cutting me out so completely. Thought maybe he was dealing with some deeper issues that I didn't understand, but still believed my advice had been sound even if my delivery was harsh. Mum would occasionally update me about Nolan. Apparently he'd started seeing a therapist and was doing better. Had gotten a promotion at work and seemed more stable, but still wouldn't talk about me or explain why he'd cut contact. Would change the subject whenever she brought up family relationships. Made me feel like I was being painted as some kind of villain in a situation where I'd only tried to help. Fast forward to last month, 3 years after our last conversation. Mum asked me to help clean out the storage room at her house. Found a bunch of old boxes from when Nolan moved out of his childhood bedroom. Most of it was just random teenage stuff and old electronics. But at the bottom of one box was a notebook I'd never seen before. Looked like a journal he'd been keeping around the time of our phone call. Knew I probably shouldn't read it, but curiosity got the better of me. Thought maybe it would help me understand what had gone wrong between us. Figured if he'd wanted it to stay private, he wouldn't have left it behind. Started flipping through pages of his handwriting. First few entries were pretty mundane stuff about work and daily activities. But as I kept reading, started seeing mentions of feeling off and struggling to concentrate. Descriptions of lying awake at night with his heart racing for no reason. Detailed accounts of panic attacks that sounded genuinely terrifying. Wrote about feeling like he was losing his mind and didn't know what was happening to him. One entry described an incident at work where he'd had to lock himself in a bathroom stall. Because he felt like he couldn't breathe and thought he was having a heart attack, wrote about how embarrassed he was and how he'd made an excuse about food poisoning. Mentioned researching symptoms online and finding information about anxiety disorders. Said he was scared to tell anyone because he didn't want people to think he was crazy. Kept reading and found more entries about his internal struggle. Wrote about feeling ashamed for not being able to handle normal stress like everyone else. Mentioned feeling like he was weak and broken compared to other people. Described the depression as this heavy weight that made everything feel impossible. Said he felt guilty for struggling because he knew other people had real problems. Then found the entry dated the day after our phone conversation. My stomach dropped as I read his account of our call. Tried to talk to Sarah tonight about what's been happening. Thought she of all people would understand since she's always posting about mental health. But she basically told me I'm just making excuses and need to man up. Said I'm being weak and that I should just deal with my problems. Continued reading with growing horror at his perspective. I know Sarah thinks I'm just being dramatic, but I can barely get out of bed most days. The panic attacks are getting worse and I feel like I'm drowning. If my own sister thinks I'm just weak and making excuses, maybe she's right. Maybe I really am just pathetic and can't handle normal adult life. Don't think I can talk to anyone else about this now. Next few entries were really dark. Wrote about feeling completely alone and like there was something fundamentally wrong with him. Mentioned feeling betrayed because he'd trusted me and I'd dismissed everything he was going through. Said he couldn't bear the thought of anyone else reacting the way I had. Wrote, if Sarah, who advocates for mental health, thinks I'm just weak, what would other people think? Found entries where he'd researched therapists but was too scared to make an appointment. Worried they would also think he was just making excuses or being dramatic. Wrote about feeling like he couldn't trust his own perceptions anymore. Said my reaction made him question whether his suffering was even real. Mentioned feeling like maybe he deserved to feel this way because he was weak. Several entries about how much it hurt that I'd used the phrase man up. Wrote about how he'd always looked up to me and respected my opinions on social issues. Said hearing me use that exact toxic language felt like being slapped. Mentioned seeing my posts about supporting men's mental health and feeling confused and angry. Wondered how I could advocate for others while dismissing his struggles so easily. One entry really hit me hard. Sarah always talks about how harmful it is when society tells men to suppress emotions. But when I tried to be vulnerable with her, she basically said the same things she claims to be against. I guess it's easy to be supportive online, but harder when it's your own family member. Maybe I really am just weak, and she was being honest about what she actually thinks. Kept reading through months of entries documenting his journey to finally getting help. Wrote about how long it took him to trust a therapist because of my reaction. Mentioned having to work through feelings of shame and self-doubt that my words had reinforced. Described slowly learning that his experiences were valid and that he wasn't weak or broken. Talked about the progress he was making, but also the lasting impact of feeling rejected by family. Found an entry from about 6 months later where he'd written about me specifically. I think Sarah genuinely believes she's supportive of mental health awareness. But there's a difference between posting about issues online and actually supporting real people. Maybe she can advocate for strangers, but when it comes to people close to her, old judgments kick in. Or maybe she just likes the image of being progressive more than actually doing the work. Another entry. I keep thinking about how Sarah talks about toxic masculinity and emotional suppression. But when I tried to open up about real emotions and real struggles, she shut me down immediately. Told me to man up, which is literally the exact phrase she says is harmful to men. It's like she can intellectually understand these concepts but can't apply them to real situations. One of the last entries about me was devastating. I've realized I need to protect my mental health by limiting contact with people who can't support me, even if that includes family members who think they're helping but are actually harmful. Sarah isn't a safe person for me to be vulnerable with, and that's not my fault or something I need to fix. Sat there in Mum's storage room, reading my brother's private thoughts about me, realizing that everything I thought I understood about the situation was completely wrong. He hadn't been dramatic or weak or looking for excuses. He'd been genuinely suffering and had trusted me enough to reach out for support. And I'd responded with exactly the kind of toxic language I claimed to be against. Started thinking about all the posts I'd made about mental health awareness, articles I'd shared about the importance of believing people when they talk about their struggles, content about how harmful it is to dismiss depression and anxiety as personal failings. Remembered the discussion group I'd started about toxic masculinity and emotional suppression, realized I'd been advocating for these principles while completely failing to apply them to my own brother. Thought about how I'd told him to man up and stop being weak, the exact language I regularly condemned when other people used it. Remembered feeling annoyed that he was complaining about feeling overwhelmed, how I'd assumed he was just making excuses instead of listening to what he was actually saying. Realized I'd been more concerned with being right than with understanding his experience. Kept thinking about his journal entries describing how my reaction had made him doubt himself, how he'd questioned whether his suffering was real because I'd dismissed it so easily, how it had taken him longer to get help because he was scared of being judged again, the fact that he'd specifically mentioned feeling betrayed because he'd trusted me. Realized that my words had actively caused harm to someone I loved. Started remembering all the times over the past 3 years when I'd felt hurt by his silence, how I'd painted myself as the victim in the situation, convinced myself that he was punishing me for trying to help. Never considered that my help had actually been harmful and invalidating. Realized he'd been protecting himself from further damage, not punishing me. Thought about all my advocacy work and how passionate I'd been about these issues. Realized there was a huge gap between my intellectual understanding and my actual behavior. Had learned the right language and concepts about mental health and toxic masculinity. But when faced with a real situation involving someone close to me, defaulted to harmful judgments. Understood that posting about issues online was different from actually supporting people in real life. Started seeing how my reaction had been influenced by unconscious biases I thought I'd overcome. How I'd expected Nolan to handle his problems the way I would handle mine. Hadn't considered that different people have different capacities and challenges. Realized I'd been more concerned with maintaining my image as someone who has it together than with empathy. Saw how my privileged position of not struggling with mental health issues had made me judgmental. Thought about how I'd specifically used the phrase man up despite knowing how harmful that language is. Realized I'd been perpetuating the exact toxic masculinity I claimed to be fighting against. Understood that I'd reinforced societal messages that men should suppress emotions and handle problems alone. Saw how my reaction had confirmed his fears about being judged for showing vulnerability. Realized I'd contributed to the very problem I thought I was advocating against. Kept thinking about his description of feeling betrayed, specifically because he'd trusted me. Remembered how he'd mentioned my social media posts about mental health. Realized he'd reached out to me partially because he thought I'd be understanding and supportive. Understood that my hypocrisy had been especially painful because of my public stance on these issues. Saw how I'd failed him not just as a sister, but as someone who claimed to care about these causes. Started understanding why he'd cut off all contact instead of trying to explain or argue. Realized that my reaction had probably felt so invalidating and harmful that protecting himself was the priority. Thought about how much courage it must have taken for him to reach out in the first place. Understood that my dismissive response had likely felt like confirmation of his worst fears about being judged. Saw why he wouldn't want to risk being vulnerable with me again. Sat there feeling the full weight of how badly I'd messed up. Realized that everything I'd thought about the situation was wrong. Understood that I'd been the toxic person in the dynamic, not him. Saw how my actions had directly contradicted everything I claimed to believe. Felt sick thinking about how much unnecessary suffering I'd caused him. Thought about all the opportunities I'd had to recognize my mistake over the past 3 years. How I could have done research about depression and anxiety instead of assuming I knew better. Could have reflected on whether my advice had actually been helpful instead of getting defensive. Could have considered that maybe there was more to the situation than I understood. Realized I'd been too proud and self-righteous to consider that I might have been wrong. Started thinking about how this reflected on my advocacy work in general. Wondered how many other times I'd been performative rather than genuinely supportive. Realized that sharing articles and posts was easy, but actually supporting people required more effort. Understood that I'd been more invested in appearing progressive than in doing the actual work. Saw how my ego had gotten in the way of truly understanding and helping others. Thought about Nolan working through therapy and getting better despite my harmful response. Felt proud of him for persisting and getting help even after I'd made it harder. Realized his strength in cutting off contact and protecting his mental health. Understood that his silence hadn't been weakness or punishment, but self-care and wisdom. Saw how much growth and healing he'd done without my input or support. Sitting in that storage room, finally understood why my brother had rejected me. Realized I'd been a toxic, hypocritical person who'd preached about mental health awareness online, but completely dismissed and invalidated his genuine suffering when he'd trusted me with it. Understood that my reaction had been exactly the kind of harmful response I claimed to be against. Saw how I'd contributed to the very problems I thought I was fighting. Felt the full impact of recognizing that I'd been the insufferable one all along. Not him for struggling with mental health issues, but me for being judgmental and hypocritical. Realized that all my advocacy work meant nothing if I couldn't support the people closest to me. Understood that I'd failed not just as a sister, but as a person who claimed to care about these causes. Saw how much damage my ego and assumptions had caused to someone I loved. Closed the journal and sat there processing everything I'd learned. Finally understood why Nolan had cut off all contact and why he'd been right to do so. Realized I needed to completely reevaluate my approach to advocacy and supporting others. Understood that real allyship required humility, listening, and examining my own biases. Saw how much work I needed to do to become the kind of person I thought I already was. 3 years too late, finally getting it, realizing I'd been exactly the kind of toxic person I claimed to be fighting against. Understanding that Nolan had shown incredible strength and wisdom in protecting himself from me. Seeing how my insufferable, hypocritical behavior had driven away someone who'd trusted me. Knowing I had no right to contact him, but hoping someday he might be willing to let me try to make amends.